Good evening and welcome to today's panel discussion entitled Anti-apartheid Solidarity, South Africa and Palestine. My name is Farah Kutene and I'll be hosting this panel discussion on behalf of the Palestinian Return Centre. أهلا وسهلا بكم في أسبوع العودة الذي يستضيفه مركز العودة الفلسطيني في London. During this evening's panel discussion, we'll be hearing from our esteemed panel of speakers who will be delving in depth into the connections and solidarity and struggle between South Africa and Palestine. We'll be touching on South Africa's case of genocide in the International Court of Justice, the connections between both South Africa and Palestine, the rich history of solidarity, and also the strong relationship between the apartheid South African regime and Israel. Before introducing our speakers, just wanted to mention there will be a Q&A after all of our speakers have spoken, if we have time, so please do comment your questions in the YouTube and Facebook comment section. Thank you. Our first speaker of today's panel is Heidi Grunbaum. Heidi is a writer and scholar. She's a director of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. Her work focuses on the afterlives of genocide, war and forced displacement, post-colonial studies, and aesthetics and politics. She's the author of Memorializing the Past, Everyday Life in South Africa After the TRC, co-editor of Uncontained, Opening the Community Art Project Archive, and The Home in Mind. With Mark J. Kaplan, she made the documentary entitled The Village Under the Forest on the Nakba Village, Lubia, and South Africa Forest, the JNF forest planted over its ruins. She is currently working with Kaplan on a second documentary on the political instrumentalization of Jewish memory in Germany. Over to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Farah, and greetings to the audience. My warm thanks to Farah and to the Palestine Land Society for this humbling and beautiful invitation. I'd just like to open my brief comments with an anecdote, if I may. As a kind of South African Jewish white person who turned to Zionism as a way to deal with the kind of moral conundrum of apartheid in South Africa, and having long abandoned that after encountering a second engagement in one lifetime with apartheid, I want to name and honor a group of mainly men, former guerrilla fighters with Umkhonto weSizwe, with whom I had the real honor of working with from 1999 until 2006. And it was through them that I was introduced to the Palestinian struggle and to the long solidarity between the liberation movement in South Africa and Palestine. But I want my comments to kind of go in a slightly different direction. And particularly since this is an audience that is not only well versed in the context and history of the background to the events of October 7th, and many of whom have lived through and carry that experience every day. The background, context, history. I'd like to focus my comments today on that day, in thinking about apartheid, anti-apartheid solidarity, South Africa and Palestine. And the reason I'd like to focus my comments on that day is because it was the day on which the status quo dynamics of apartheid Israel's occupation, its settler colonialism, its Nakba, its apartheid, were shifted fundamentally. In South Africa, almost everyone you speak to can tell you where they were and what they were doing on the morning of Saturday, 7th of October, when first hearing of and seeing footage of Hamas's historic breach of the barrier incarcerating Palestinians in Gaza and the inaugural action of Al-Aqsa flood. Such has been the extent and scale of the unprecedented nature of that action and of the massacre in Israel that morning, that the collective perception Israel has long repeated to Israelis, and it's still not, and thankfully still not fully nationalized diaspora, that Israel represents and guarantees the protection of Jewish life after the Holocaust has been shattered. A sense of existential vulnerability in that society is contributing to its increased impulse to lager, to annihilate, but also to close in on itself while embarking on its genocidal assault against Gaza that we're watching unfold daily and nightly for the past almost, 130 days. Hamas's operation rallied Palestinians and their allies across geographies and generations, offering a palpable glimpse of the possibility of future freedom and energizing the liberation struggle. While in a deeply fractured society whose fault lines are seamed over in times of war and of actions such as its undertaking now, the Israeli regime has attempted to unite its society around a collective existential fear intensified by its political abuse of the Holocaust and the transgenerational memories of that genocide in order to support its own genocide on Palestinians. The 7th of October, authored by the Palestinian resistance, represents in many people's assessments the long beginning of the end of the Zionist project. To apprehend this at the same time as witnessing Israel's annihilation of life and its conditions, the conditions for life in Gaza, for the past some 130 days, has rendered thinking into and across these intensities incredibly difficult. How to imagine political futures and what opportunities does this offer? My own work in the last few years on being implicated in regimes, annihilatory, genocidal, colonial, apartheid regimes have focused on the question of complicity. So I want to leave aside that discussion for now. I think it's also important. It kind of asks for light to fall or to be shed on the shadows of the struggle. But following Hamas's actions on the 7th of October, a new horizon of expanded possibilities for the freedom struggle has opened. Perceived as such, a confident, energized, morally resonant Palestinian discourse is audible on television screens and radios and digital platforms. And since the first week of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, on the streets and in the squares and in sanctuaries and in refugee camps and in cities and in villages across the world with no sign of letting up. The seismic nature of the 7th of October action carries consequences for global geopolitics that are enormous, as much as they are for changing the possibilities for a non-partitioned future in historic Palestine. More than ever, the Palestinian struggle carries a moral gravitas and political symbolism far beyond the geography and history of the lands that constitute Israel, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. In other words, historic Palestine. In this sense, as John Collins and Rashid Khalidi and many others have proposed, global Palestine is also at the heart of the seismic shifts underway in this post-Cold War rearrangement of a world that had been shaped by American unipolarity and Western hegemony, to an as yet still emergent one of hopefully multilateralism, hopefully cooperation, and hopefully non-domination. In this sense, the Palestinian struggle represents a promise of freedom for the Palestinians and for all who live on the lands that constitute historic Palestine, as well as to the rest of us, to the people of the world, who cherish and desire dignity, justice, equality, and peace. In the wake of 2023 developments in the BRICS alliance, of which South Africa is a key member, South Africa's case at the ICJ against Israel for pursuing genocide against Palestinians is opening new opportunities and further avenues for solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, which I hope we can discuss further. Some 23 years after the World Conference Against Racism, hosted by South Africa in Durban in 2001, at which the NGO Forum declared that Zionism is equal to racism and Zionism is equal to apartheid, South Africa's intervention at the ICJ comes at a moment when I believe the analogy with apartheid in South Africa, or South African apartheid, as opposed to Israeli apartheid, may have reached its limit. Yet at the same time, South Africa's landmark intervention on behalf of the moral conscience of the majority of the world, and with the support of large parts of what is known as the Global South, and as a country and a society that knows too well and too recently the ravages of colonialism and apartheid, all these stand as an inspiring and hugely significant intervention, highlighting the importance of aligning future political developments with international law, and hopefully where international law is not the horizon, but actually a new political arrangement. So whilst the analogy has reached a limit, we cannot, in the wake of South Africa's intervention at the ICJ, but recall with a new reinvigorated sense of energy and hopefulness the national liberation struggle in South Africa, but also the silence and complicity of the West, and also the refusal of this complicity by international civil society and the anti-apartheid movement through comprehensive boycotts, and eventually by states which introduced measures that included sanctions that isolated and weakened the apartheid regime in South Africa, complementing in very important ways the political work of the liberation movement. So I'd like to stop here, and I'd like to just pause a moment in honor of the enormous sacrifice made by Palestinians in Gaza and across historic Palestine. Thank you, and thank you, Farah.
Thank you, Heidi. Always insightful and diligently put, and thank you again. If you do have any questions for our speakers, for Heidi, for Salim, for Tula, then please do leave them in the comment section below, and we'll try to cover them all at the end. Thank you again, Heidi. Our next speaker for this evening's panel is Tula Simpson. Tula is presently Associate Professor of History in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria. He obtained his doctorate in Birkbeck, University of London. His articles have appeared in a number of leading subject journals, including the African Historical Review, the Journal of Southern African Studies, Social Dynamics, and the South African Historical Journal. He is the author of Umkhonto Sizwe, the ANC's Armed Struggle, the History of South Africa from 1902 to present, and is the editor of the ANC and the Liberation Struggle Essential Writings. And most recently, History Beyond Apartheid, New Approaches in South African Historiography, and his current research is supported by the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences and the National Research Fund, the NRF in South Africa. Over to you, Tula.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and good to see you all. What I'd like to focus my presentation on is aspects of the relationship between the South African liberation movement and the question of Palestine-Israel. As Farah stated, my research was on, first research was on Umkhonto we Sizwe and the ANC's armed struggle. The decision to turn to violence by the ANC followed the massacre of at least 69 Black people at Sharpeville in March 1960. Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed in December 1961 and it started its first operation soon afterwards. Interestingly enough, the first central amongst the first inspirations for Umkhonto we Sizwe were the Jewish freedom fighters in the 1948 War of Independence. One of the few in the ANC who had any battlefield experience was Arthur Goldreich. And as Nelson Mandela wrote in his autobiography, in the 1940s, Arthur had fought with the Palmach, the military wing of the Jewish national movement in Palestine. He was knowledgeable about guerrilla warfare and helped fill in many gaps in my understanding. Goldreich himself went to live in Israel, where he became a critic of the prominent racism within that society. But it's interesting to note that Mandela also read Menachem Begin's The Revolt, the story of Ergun, and that helped to inform his writings about the kind of military unit that he wanted to form as a part of Umkhonto we Sizwe. There's no evidence that I can see that Mandela identified himself with the Palestinian cause before his imprisonment in 1963. In fact, when he, as I say, when he established MK, many of his key inspirations were Israeli. But during his 27-year imprisonment, Nelson Mandela would have been aware of the support the ANC received from other countries of Asian solidarity and the broad strokes of the PLO's struggle. But detailed knowledge of the South African situation would have been difficult enough to obtain, let alone what was happening in Palestine. Now, as far as Israel and South Africa were concerned, in the early days, as Sasha Polakov-Saransky wrote, Israeli leaders' ideological hostility to apartheid kept the two nations apart. In 1963, Golda Meir tells the UN General Assembly that Israelis naturally opposed policies of apartheid, colonialism, and racial or religious discrimination. But things began to change after the 1967 war, which saw the Israeli state seize territory from its Arab neighbors, tripling its size in just 6 days. The settlement project followed, as you're well aware, and it's saddled Israel with the stigma of occupation, forever tarring it with the colonialist brush. And as far as administration of a area in which there are the Arab and Israeli population, it also births the question of apartheid with regards to Israeli policy as well, creating an analogy between the two systems. After the Yom Kippur War, Polakov-Saransky adds, all but a few African countries severed diplomatic ties with the Jewish state, and it was not long before Israel initiated defense cooperation with some of the world's most brutal regimes, including Argentina's military dictatorship, Pinochet's Chile, and apartheid South Africa. Now, one of the things that the South African government was very determined to do during the liberation struggle was to try and prove a link between the ANC and two organizations in particular. One of them was the Irish Republican Army, and the other is the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was to find an analogy that would work in Western audiences with regards to providing an analogy between the struggle which the apartheid regime faced and which Western states faced, and the situation in Ireland and Israel was thought to be two analogies which could follow. They tried very hard, but there were very limited direct connections between the ANC and Palestine in terms of the armed struggle. The ANC had a support network backed by the Soviet Union and other states, which provided for most of its needs in terms of bases and training. In February 1990, Nelson Mandela is released, and 16 days after his release from prison, he arrived in Lusaka, the home of the African National Congress's exiled leadership at the time. There was a whole series of leaders sympathetic to the ANC cause who greeted him, but one of them is Yasser Arafat, and we see here a sort of analogous process developing where the PLO is quite consciously trying to associate itself with the ANC with regards to sister struggles against a similar form of colonialism, settler colonialism, which takes an apartheid form. Mandela reciprocated that show of support 3 months later when he attended a summit in Algiers wearing the Palestinian keffiyeh. Mandela was invited to visit the United States in June 1990 that year. And the invitation was by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the president at that time. And whilst he was there, he was questioned repeatedly about his ties to leaders like Fidel Castro, Muammar Gaddafi, and Arafat. What he said is that we are grateful to the world for supporting our struggle, but we're an independent organization with its own policy. Our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country to our struggle. Arafat, Gaddafi, Castro support our struggle to the hilt. Our attitude is based solely on the fact that they fully support the anti-apartheid struggle. They do not support it only in rhetoric. What you see there is the nascence of what will become South Africa's foreign policy, and it's a narrative which we can take to February, to 2024. In other words, South Africa is a country which is economically dependent on the West. Its ties with the West are central, but you have Nelson Mandela articulating this doctrine where we have a right to form our friendships with whoever we choose. Mandela doubled down repeatedly, explaining that a liberation movement involved in its own struggle. The ANC had no time to be looking into the internal affairs of other countries. And he said, as far as the PLO is concerned, we identify with the PLO because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination. So there's a doctrine also of solidarity here with sister struggles against an unjust world order, which is ultimately backed by the same forces. By contrast, in 1993, Mandela says the ANC was extremely unhappy with Israel's collaboration with the apartheid government. He said that the ANC had not forgotten that many of the weapons the apartheid government used were deployed to kill people were brought from Israel. And despite the objections and hostility of the West, Arafat and Castro attended the inauguration ceremony for Mandela in 1994. And you had Arafat and Castro sitting a discreet distance away from Vice President Al Gore and Hillary Clinton. And this was at a time when Washington treated the PLO and Cuba's communist government as pariahs. Here we see the sort of honeymoon period of South African freedom, where there is there's almost a buy that the country gets from the Western powers, a certain indulgence as far as that is concerned, where the ANC is allowed to push back to a certain degree against this global economic order. And Nelson Mandela is capable of doing that because he has the prestige to do so. The ANC tailored its foreign policy after 1990 on the basis of its experience in the liberation struggle. They view themselves as pushing for a new international order, and the Palestinian struggle as an extension of the ANC's one. There's no strictly economic rationale for these bonds of solidarity. It's more an affinity, part of a worldview that looks upon these as being separate fronts in a shared global struggle. In 1997, while still president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela made the statement, which has been quoted many times, that we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. This context is vital to understanding comments made by Mandela during a state visit to Palestine in 1999. He said in Gaza that he felt home amongst compatriots. At the time, though, he said, choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases where we cannot proceed, or we cannot move forward. Then if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence. So we see the ANC backing itself behind the two-state solution and backing itself behind its traditional ally, which is Arafat's Fatah organization. There's no similar affinity for Hamas at any stage. And this affection was reciprocated. Nelson Mandela dies in December 2013. There's a memorial in the area of Jerusalem's Old City 2 days later. And indeed, 3 years afterwards, the people of Palestine repaid the favor by unveiling a giant statue of Mandela in the occupied West Bank city of Ramallah. We've had the ANC fulfilling its traditional foreign policy doctrine inherited by Mandela in the two major global controversies which have erupted since 2022. The first, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we had the American ambassador, Ruben Brigitte, rapping South Africa over the knuckles over its repeated contrarian votes in international forums, refusing to condemn Russia for that invasion. What you see there is the beginning of a trend, and it's difficult to discern because it's still early stages how far it will go, of the Western states beginning to push back against South Africa's, what South Africa would develop, would present, as being its non-aligned position. And the other major international flashpoint, of course, has been the situation after the October the 7th Al-Aqsa flood Hamas operation in southern Israel. South African President Nelson Mandela condemned that attack. And as the assaults into Gaza continued, there's been increased solidarity, which has been shown by the presidency towards the Palestinian people. And of course, the ICJ case is a part of that. One thing that I would add, though, however, and emphasize here is that this is deeper. It may not be possible for this to resonate in an international audience. The resonance which the Gaza struggle that is presently underway has assumed with Black South Africans is actually quite profound. It's difficult to document it in objective form, but certainly with regards to that instinctive, visceral sympathy, there is a very high level of identification with the struggle of the Palestinian people. So it should not be viewed as a regime to movement solidarity. It should be very much viewed as a people-to-people solidarity. And it's such a nature that opposition parties who normally would be quite belligerent towards the ANC have found it difficult to attack them on this particular stance. Going forward into the future, it's a indeterminate book, which we can't predict exactly where we will go in the future, but there are tendencies which show that the West is liable to increasingly push back against South Africa for its increasingly independent foreign policy stance. And so that's one to follow. That's the outline that I have. Thank you very much for your time. I will pass over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Tudor. Thank you so much for your input there. I'm going to go on to our final speaker of the panel. And just a reminder to everyone tuning in online, please do leave any questions that you have for our speakers in the comment sections on both YouTube and Facebook, and we'll get our speakers to answer them at the end of all the speakers' presentations. So our third and final speaker is Salim Vali. Salim is the South African National Research Foundation's Chair in Community, Adult and Workers Education, and a professor based at the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. He is also an elected member of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa and a visiting professor at the Nelson Mandela University. He studied at the Universities of York, Witwatersrand, and KwaZulu-Natal, and was previously a school teacher and a trade unionist before joining Wits University's Education Policy Unit in 1994. Vali joined UJ in 2009 and was a visiting lecturer at Columbia and York Universities. He serves on the editorial boards of 4 academic journals, is on the board of various global and local organizations, and is active in various social and solidarity movements. Vali is a long-serving member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign of South Africa and a coordinating committee member of the South African BDS Coalition. His latest co-edited books are The University and Social Justice Struggles Across the Globe and Against Racial Capitalism, the selected writings of Neville Alexander. Over to you, Salim.
Thanks very much, Farah, and ahlan wa sahlan to all who have joined us, and special warm greetings to my colleagues, Professor Heidi and Professor Tula, and for their insightful comments as well. My presentation will be in 3 parts, and I'm going to briefly talk about some comments I made at the annual Palestine lecture in March of last year at the Center for Palestine Studies at SOAS. And then I'm going to segue to the ICJ case and its significance. And finally, I'll talk about the solidarity between South Africans and Palestinians. I'll end by talking to some of the views of the South African BDS coalition and solidarity organizations in South Africa, who I must say have grown in leaps and bounds over the past 3 months, and who have been active almost every day throughout the country. The reason why I'm going to start with the comments I made at SOAS is I talked about the new nature of the Israeli government. I mentioned Ben-Gvir, his appointment as Minister for Internal Affairs in Netanyahu's government, along with other far-right ideologues, Avigdor Moaz, who overseeing school curriculum, Smotrich, the finance minister, also responsible for building settlements in the occupied territories, and how all of this effectively jettisons the old tropes liberal Zionists employed to defend Israel. We've heard it all, that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. It seeks a peaceful settlement with Palestinians in a two-state solution, that extremism and racism have no place in Israeli society, and that Israel must impose draconian forms of control on the Palestinians only to prevent terrorism. This has been completely exposed now. I mean, without getting into how Ben-Gvir is a disciple of the genocidal Rabbi Meir Kahane and considers Baruch Goldstein, a mass murderer, a hero, how this Kahanist ideology that led to the particular massacre at the Ibrahimi Mosque in 1994 by Goldstein isn't just history. It's the same ideology is mainstream in present-day Israel, and massacres are carried out no longer by individual gunmen, but coordinated by the army and police with regularity. Remember, I gave this talk shortly after the pogrom at Huwaira. There are other notorious senior members of the Netanyahu government, including Zvika Fogel, who chairs the Israeli Parliament's National Security Committee. And at the beginning of last year, Fogel called for, and I quote, a final war against Palestinians. And I quote again, to subdue them once and for all. So what I said in that address is, while I certainly agree that the Israeli government, Netanyahu government, represents continuity in the political development of the Zionist project, there is a caveat. Netanyahu's government is indeed not only a case of going from bad to worse, but at a certain point, quantitative change becomes qualitative. The new government, and this was in March, long before October the 7th, the new government, and I quote, has a clear genocidal strategy unencumbered by what is called international opinion. The horrors that they will unleash will create very distinct challenges and opportunities for both Palestinian resistance and movements of international solidarity. So the point I made there is that although the old liberal Zionist tropes Israel employed to justify itself and its repression of Palestinians were always more fiction than reality in any case. And Israel long ago became an apartheid state. But these liberal tropes have very clearly were replaced by the new government by really screed-full diatribes that painted Palestinians and Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, in a particular way, which made it easier for this genocide, which, Ilan Pappé until then called an incremental genocide. The Nakba, of course, did not stop, but it's just gained momentum after October the 7th, much more momentum. So some call it the second Nakba. Of course, many people say it's a continuation of the Nakba. So for us who always knew that Israel's so-called democracy was a deception, that it was always a settler colony enterprise maintained through apartheid and military rule from the beginning, there was still a lot to be concerned with. And I ended my analysis by quoting Jamal Juma of the Stop the World campaign, who also very presciently said that, the extent and brutality of the crimes of the apartheid regime are staggering, though unsurprising. Of course, he said this before October the 7th. Israel's regimes has been granted impunity for everything it did so far. This has allowed it to shed all restraints, while the responsibility is on the international community. The price is being paid by the Palestinian people. However grim the reality looks for Palestinians, this may also be the moment of change. They say that the night is darkest just before dawn breaks. So I will argue in a few minutes why this moment is a tipping point. Some call it the Vietnam moment, others call it the South African moment. And what the ICJ order did is, and the pronouncement of the judges, near unanimous pronouncement, it stripped Israel of this impunity. And the historic judgment demonstrate the validity of really a meticulously compiled case by the South African legal team, with support from others like Blini, now the King's Council, as they call it. And what many people increasingly, and especially over the past 3 months, in the court of world public opinion, people can see the genocide unfolding on their screens. And what the ICJ has done is very significant. And, they mentioned the plausibility of South Africa's charge under the Genocide Convention, and I quote, that Israel has engaged in, is engaging in, and risks further engaging in genocidal acts against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I think all of us, I won't go through the articles of the Genocide Convention and what the ICJ judges said, that until the final determination is made regarding Gaza, Israel must stop killing Palestinian civilians, etc., destroying homes and infrastructure. And of course, as we know, Israel has continued to do that. While the court fell short of explicitly ordering an immediate and permanent ceasefire to stop the genocide, in the words of our minister, Naledi Pandor, how do you provide aid and water without a ceasefire? If you read the order, by implication, a ceasefire must happen. So I will talk about the meaning of this, the significance of this, but I will also talk about the limitations of international law. Today, we know, as of today or yesterday, that the death toll stands at 30,000, excluding 8,000 people missing, presumably buried under the rubble, with 70,000 people injured, almost 5% of Gaza's population. And really, in South African terms, the equivalent of 3.25 million South Africans. And of course, 75% of the people killed are children, the women, and elderly, particularly for those of us in universities. And there have been massive mobilizations across campuses in South Africa. The extent of the horror and the bombardments, the destruction of schools and universities, let alone hospitals, and the killing of medics and journalists, but also of academics, has led people to also call it a scholasticide, a pattern of colonial attacks on Palestinian scholars, students, and educational institutions. But what has made matters worse, and the heads of international humanitarian organizations, Amnesty International, Oxfam, have really expressed strong concern on recent, and I quote, harrowing developments in Rafah, including mass starvation, how Palestinians are facing famine and the outbreak of disease in the face, and how 1.5 million people are crammed into a small space the size of what people estimate to be Heathrow Airport. I just saw images which will probably stay with me for a long, long time, like other images, how Palestinians today, just before this webinar, how Palestinians have been forced to eat animal feed, grass, and weeds, and how when the aid trucks come, very few and far between, how Israeli soldiers actually fire at Palestinians trying to get access to these aid packages, and images of kids stuffing their pockets with flour that spilled on the ground. So this is the situation. And I think the other significant aspects of the South African application is how it speaks to and recognizes the contexts of the current genocide. And it states, and I quote, that an ongoing Nakba through Israel's colonization since 1948 has been perpetrated on the Palestinians. I think the significance of the ICJ judgment is also how it might force the hand of the ICC chief prosecutor Karim Khan, who many believe must be forced to resign and be charged with complicity for his abject failure to act against the genocidal Israeli government officials. Now, international law alone, very important. And I've explained why this is important, why alone it cannot bring justice. And it's only our relentless mobilization to building people's power that can ultimately end international state corporate and institutional complicity in Israel's 75-year-old regime of settler colonialism and apartheid. Just to end on the ICJ, Mohsen Al-Attar, writing in Opinio Juris, a legal journal associated with the International Commission of Jurists, had this to say, and it's very significant. The ICJ, this is just before the order was given, the ICJ faced a stark choice: fine in favor of South Africa and indicate provisional measures, or damn international law into oblivion. International law has been extremely unkind to Palestinians, inconsistent with the concerns of people in the majority world, and in a sense, Western countries and the judges themselves and this apex court itself were in the dock. And whether this ruling leads to Palestinian self-determination or, more modestly, an international law worthy of its name is anyone's guess. Of course, the Security Council at the UN needs to be reformed. But what we do know now is that the future of Palestine is no longer in Israeli hands, just as the future of international law is no longer in the hands of the Western world itself. And as a member of the BDS coalition and solidarity organizations for many years, the time has come now to really wield the weapon of BDS in support of the Palestinian people, for whom simply to exist is to resist. And now is the time to disrupt business as usual with the genocidal state of Israel and those countries and companies that are complicit. And Israel has to be seen in all its nakedness as a terrorist and barbaric state that must be reduced to a pariah in the world, just as its late, unlamented former friend, apartheid Israel. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the issues Professor Tula already covered, but just to say that the whole descriptor, apartheid, I want to say a word or two about it. Over the past few years, as we know, a number of organizations have concluded that systemic and widespread discriminatory Israeli policies and practices against the Palestinians amounts to a violation of the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. This was passed just shortly after the Soweto uprising, but it's not limited to South Africa. But of course, Palestinians and South Africans have been saying this for decades. The Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, in a recent report on human rights in the occupied territories, laments that while the international community has not fully acted upon it, she makes the point that the concept that Israeli occupation meets the legal threshold of apartheid is gaining traction. The legal threshold set by the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. I'm not really going to talk about all the reports that have come up since 2021, the B'Tselem report titled A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. 3 months later, Human Rights Watch echoed the finding in a really exhaustive report, which concluded damningly that Israeli authorities are committing crimes against humanity in the form of apartheid. And a year after that, in January 2022, Amnesty International's report, Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. Very significantly, the report outlined key components, including territorial fragmentation, segregation and control, dispossession of land and property, the denial of basic economic and social rights, and the suppression of Palestinians' human development. I just want to say and end on this section by saying that, as early as 1976, Palestinians like Abdel Wahab al-Masri wrote a book called Israel and South Africa, The Progression of a Relationship. And since then, up to 2015, Ilan Pape's edited book, Israel and South Africa, The Many Faces of Apartheid. And Professor Tula mentioned Sasha Polanski, who showed also the links between apartheid South Africa and Israel. I think that Francesca Albanese's September 2022 report is also important because she talks about the limitations of the apartheid framework. She said that first, with few exceptions, the scope of recent reports on Israeli apartheid is primarily territorial and excludes the experience of Palestinian refugees. And for the Palestine Return Center, what she had to say about the right of return is really very important. And also that the recognition of Israeli apartheid must address the experience of Palestinian people in its entirety, in the occupied territories, but also in the diaspora, in refugee camps. She stressed the unity of the people, including those, of course, that were displaced, denationalized, and dispossessed. She mentioned a number of other points, which makes us look at the apartheid analogy more critically, and how it doesn't address the root causes, which she called settler colonialism, which in itself is a war crime under the Rome Statutes. And of course, after her report, the Al-Haq report echoed a lot of what she said, which I'm not going to go through. So the last section, the whole question of South Africa and Israel. I'm often asked, why do South Africans, why are they so interested in the Palestinian struggle? And I think Tula expressed this very clearly. There has always been a visceral identification with the Palestinian people. You know, Leila Khalid, for example, is seen in South Africa on par with Che Guevara. When she comes to South Africa, and she's come here often, she is treated in a particular way, and she has lots of fans and status in our country. But beyond that, you know, both societies were settler colonial formations formed by Europeans, overseen by British imperialism. They enacted particular racist states in 1948, which is just coincidental, but relying on white supremacy and its civilizing mission, complemented by the messianic God's chosen people view and the gift of a promised land based on the Bible at the expense of indigenous people. So in addition to identifying with the struggles of Palestinians, South Africans also recognize that Israel's culpability in their own oppression. For instance, Israel was an important arms supplier, as Professor Tula said, to apartheid South Africa, despite the international arms embargo. And as late as 1980, 35% of Israel's arms exports were destined for South Africa. Much has been written about the subsequent relationships between apartheid South Africa and Israel, including the nuclear cooperation. But it will be suffice here to say that Israel was loyal to the apartheid state and clung to the friendship when almost all other relationships had disappeared. Israel imported, for example, South African goods and re-exported them to the world as a form of inter-racist solidarity. Israeli companies subsidized by the South African regime, despite the pittance they paid workers, were established in a number of Bantustans. I don't want to go through what Tula has said about the strong bonds that were forged between Palestinians, the PLO, and South African liberation organizations. By the way, we found out in our research that it was not just the ANC, but other liberation organizations as well. And then there's a similarity between the 65 odd pieces of discriminatory legislation in Israel that governs all aspects of everyday life, the fragmentation and theft of the land, and the matrix of security laws which existed in South Africa. A close friend of mine and somebody that Professor Heidi Groeneboom went to Palestine with. He can't go there anywhere any longer like me. We were both deported. He wrote laws about, an article about these laws and concludes that while these laws are similar, they are not the same. And actually, apartheid Israel is much more severe than what existed in South Africa. Other South Africans, like the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, also made that point. And there's one critical difference, and because of time, I can't spend too much time on it, but I have to flag it, that apartheid South Africa depended on the super exploitation of the labor of indigenous Black people. In Israel, although Israel still depends on the labor of Palestinians, certainly nowhere related to the dependence on South African labor. And Palestinians more and more have become disposable. Migrant workers have been brought in, and this makes the genocide important. I'll end, and you've been very generous, Farah, by commenting on the tipping point I mentioned. So we can derive inspiration from the solidarity South Africans received in the struggle against apartheid, but it took many decades of hard work before the boycott made an impact, despite the impression given by many venal government leaders that they supported the isolation of the racist apartheid state from the outset. This is just not true. The anti-apartheid movement was initially built by ordinary people throughout the world and their organizations, students, academics, unions, faith-based groups, cultural groups. And the anti-apartheid movement was formed in way back in 1959. The first significant breakthroughs came in 1963 when Danish dock workers refused to offload South African goods. Liverpool dock workers followed suit. So the point I'm making is that it does take time. And it takes hard work. Finally, very quickly, a few points. And these are our demands as solidarity movements. We will be having the second anti-apartheid movement launch by a number of progressive organizations, the churches, the trade unions in South Africa, and where international organizations will be invited. We are calling for the urgent need for the United Nations to reactivate and reconstitute the United Nations Special Committee against Apartheid. It played a very important role in our struggle, as well as other mechanisms to fight the regime, such as targeted and legal sanctions and comprehensive military embargo. We've started doing, and these were demands a long time ago, approaching the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, which our government has done, deploying an international protective presence to constrain the violence routinely used in the occupied Palestinian territories. Of course, we are focusing on Gaza, but we should not forget, of course, the West Bank and southern Lebanon. Stop arming apartheid Israel's war machine. This has become a clarion call throughout the world. And here we use Jeff Holper's book, War Against the People, to show how Israel, through its high-tech weaponry, securitization, and methods of pacification, plays a key role in the global suppression of human rights. And I want to really end by saying that, and to quote Adam Hania, a good friend, that it's not merely the depth of suffering or length of exile that makes the Palestinian struggle an imperative of international solidarity in the current period, like the Vietnamese struggle once was, like even prior to that, the Spanish struggle against fascism was, and later the Southern African people's struggle against racism and colonialism. But it is also the central location of the struggle of the Palestinians within the broader context of global resistance to imperialism and neoliberalism, including the climate catastrophe, and how this genocide also includes ecocide. And I can't get into it really now, but immediately the goals are hardly revolutionary. The BDS campaign is about international law, ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, dismantling the apartheid wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and most importantly, respect, protect, and promote the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. And in the words of one of Africa's greatest revolutionaries, Samara Machel, solidarity is not an act of charity, it is rather allies fighting on different terrains for the same objectives. And that was the spirit in which Tulas paraphrased Nelson Mandela's view that we will not be free until Palestinians are free. Thank you very much, Farah. You've been very patient. I apologize for perhaps taking too much time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salim. No, you didn't take too much time at all. It actually wasn't enough. It was a really insightful contribution, and thank you again. There was one comment I wanted to repeat before going into questions. There were a few questions asked from the online viewers at home to our speakers, but there's just one comment I thought should be read out loud, and then we'll go into the questions. So someone's commented, Israel was a staunch ally to the South African apartheid regime, emphasizing what our speakers have mentioned, but specifically providing anti-riot vehicles and arms to use against the native Black population, assisting the regime in creating nuclear bombs. Israel was assisting the South African apartheid regime in its nuclear weapons program. And then also, as well, Israel opposed the global embargo and boycott of apartheid South Africa. For decades, the Zionist Federation in South Africa honored men such as Percy Utah, who prosecuted Nelson Mandela for sabotage and conspiracy against the state in 1963 and sent him to jail for life, for which he served 27 years. Just that was interesting to add alongside what our speakers had mentioned. A few questions from the online audience include, okay, so there are two key questions here. Okay, so the first question is, what do we think is the long-term outcome of South Africa's case in the ICJ? Does any speaker want to touch on that first? Or can I jump to you, Salim, and then maybe Heidi, and then maybe Tula?
Well, of course, the case is going to drag on for apparently a number of years. I think, I'm not a legal expert at all, but there are a number of experts who are discussing what this means from a legal point of view. But I think for me, the most important issue is that it has put Israel in the dark, that they have been pampered and privileged in the West, that it's more difficult to do that now, that in the eyes of the world, this has shifted. It has given ballast and momentum to the Palestinian solidarity movement. All of this, Farah, is cold comfort for people in Rafah, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in South Lebanon. But I think if we see this as one tool, and we need to use as many tools as possible on the cultural level, the academic, intellectual level, trade unions, even resistance. Palestinians who are occupied, according to law, have the right to resist. So at all levels, and I think the tipping point is when all of these aspects come together. There are dangers, as we can see. Genocide is real. The number of people it's become a graveyard of children, an extermination camp. The writer Heidi will remind me, who the Germans tried to censor, wrote this piece in the New Yorker. I think she was so appropriate. Sorry?
Masha Gessen.
Exactly, Gessen, who compared Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto, and I think that is really useful comparison. So I want to stop there because I'm sure Heidi and Tula would like to comment.
Thank you, Farah, and to the person that asked the question, and thank you, Salim and Tula, for your comments. And just to jump in, obviously with the disclaimer that I'm also not only not an expert on international law, it's really not my field, but I think it's if we are to read the court case in the Netherlands last week as a sign of things to come, the ICJ case is being observed very closely by states for the possibility of third-party implication in the crime of genocide. And it was the ICJ case that got the Netherlands court case to give its own government 7 days to end the import of fighter plane parts to Israel, which has now been implemented. I understand that Spain is looking at similar. I think we're going to see more and more the kind of breakup of the, up until recently, almost homogenous bloc of the European Union's voice on Israel. And partly this is because, the kind of mask has fallen as the speakers have said before me, that the kind of the appearance of a certain kind of humane but anxious response to Palestinians that have shaped a narrative of liberal Zionism has just been exposed as the lie that it is. And I think the ICJ case has prompted, this kind of the coming apart of an homogenous European voice, which is very important, needs to be pushed, and I'm sure that activists and advocates and allies inside of Europe are doing that work, just as they're doing it inside the United States. But I would say that is without, it's impossible to know how this will unfold. At the same time, I think that there's an alarm in the kind of Euro-American West that if there's not a rush now to reinstituting the kind of parameters of Oslo, of which nothing remains, and but there's an anxious rush to resuscitate something like an Oslo, and I think that's one unanticipated danger of this moment and the ICJ moment. So to turn to some kind of notion of a two-state solution, I think we have to push against any possibility of resuscitating an apartheid solution for Israeli settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. So I think we also need to be thinking about the unanticipated and perhaps more ominous responses that might emerge from ICJ. At the same time, the political space is opening. So the work is to hold it open so that the Palestinian national movement may again become that, precisely as the legitimate voice of the Palestinian aspiration, no matter where Palestinians live. Inside 48, West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, refugee camps, and across the diaspora.
I will be very brief because I have no station of expertise to be able to overrule anybody, but the case was brought by South Africa on the basis that it was urgent to avoid irreparable harm. It seems to me as an observer that the Israeli objection is to precisely inflict irreparable harm, to force a solution which will create an irreversible fact. I view the Western states as being tacitly complicit in this. Action would have to be approved by the United Nations, adding teeth to the measures, and the United States has made it clear that it's willing to veto. Whilst there's been great progress with regards to mobilization of domestic opinion, my read is that the Western leaders think that they can ride out the opposition, and I view it as being the hope that Israel can get the messy job done, and then there will be a lot of hand-wringing and wailing, but then the effective complicity with regards to diplomacy, the vetoes, providing weaponry which supplies this to continue, blocking sanctions, that's effective complicity to create an irreversible situation. So it's a race against time, and that's what I see as being the decisive factor.
Thank you, Tula. Just to touch on something that Salim had mentioned earlier as well, and especially the relevance to the ICJ, it's just the interconnectedness of the Palestinian struggle, not specifically in terms of other struggles such as the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, but also how Palestine, for many of us, really reiterates the struggle against settler colonialism, against capitalism, against eco-genocide as well, and misogyny, and so on and so forth. And the Palestinian struggle kind of interconnects on all those bases as well. The final question that I don't believe we have much time left. We have around 10 minutes. So if all of you could answer within that time. But the last question from the online audience is: comparisons have been made between the ANC and the PLO / the Palestinian Authority in their ineffectiveness in recent years. Could the speakers touch on this? So touching on the ineffectiveness in recent years of the ANC and the PLO / Palestinian Authority. Should we jump to you, Tula, then Salim, then Heidi, or is that okay?
Ineffectiveness would be too broad. I think you need to narrow it down. I mean, the ANC has continued winning overwhelming majorities, and it shapes the future and destiny of South Africa. It's not ineffective in every way. So what would that mean? Ineffective on this question of trying to mobilize international opinion?
The comment was just that, but I assume perhaps in terms of the struggle, in terms of I would say kind of poverty, kind of as well, kind of informal parts of segregation. I kind of think in those kind of broader terms of post-apartheid South Africa, and I guess we also see the ANC as some point in history as well as revolutionary, and now it's coming under the same kind of criticism as the PA and the PLO, that now instead of being revolutionary, they're in essence counter-revolutionary, I guess along those lines.
Okay. Well, I won't, again, cannibalize too much time, but I will say that I think Professor Valley pointed out that the Palestinians have faced a much more difficult struggle in many ways against a much more powerful opponent. The ANC has been able, obviously, to achieve liberation of the country and govern for a generation, which is a fair span for any movement. So I wouldn't say that they've been totally ineffective, although they've been ineffective in some key aspects of eradicating the legacy of unemployment, inequality, and poverty, especially.
Great, on to you next, Cecilia, and then finish with Heidi.
Heidi, you want to go? I've taken up so much time.
I'll be very brief. I don't think it's a comparison that holds. The ANC is the democratically elected government of liberated South Africa, partially, at any rate, politically. There was a liberation struggle, and it is democratically elected. It was the liberation movements won freedom based on the unity of people and struggle and land, and for all the huge challenges of post-apartheid society, including 30 years later, the impossible kind of calcification of apartheid spatial organization, which contributes to a large degree, as well as a deeply problematic political economy. But we're dealing with huge challenges that are of a post-colonial nature to a large degree. And I'm putting aside legitimate criticism of the ANC as the government. The PA is an apartheid structure. It's complicit in, it's been made complicit, it's been conscripted into the apartheid regime in Israel's occupation. It has no legitimacy, very little support. There are no elections. This is occupied territory. I think that it's very important to lose the language game that gave Oslo a sheen of legitimacy around elections, representation, and so on. And I think the PAs, I think it's, I would say, from what I understand from many conversations, but also extensive reading, is that the PA is part of the problem. And I'll stop there.
I agree with both Tula and Heidi, but I just want people to understand that some of us have been, for a long time, highly critical of the ANC government, of its neoliberal policies, its inability to rupture from the past. We had a negotiated settlement. We didn't have a revolution. And inequality continues. But I must say, which includes, in fact, the legal team. Many members of the legal team have been involved in cases with social movements and mass-based organizations in opposition to the government. But on this issue, I think my colleagues are absolutely correct. All of us are proud of the stance they have taken. South Africans generally, of course, the apologists for Zionism are not, they live it. But having said that, I think we should be careful not to see those of us on the ground who meet with the ministers and director generals and have been involved in discussions on Palestinian solidarity for many, many years, understand the divisions amongst them. And there are some, like Minister Pando and others, who are very committed to the struggle, and I think Tula mentioned aspects of this in a global situation where lucre trumps solidarity. We're not living in the Cold War, etc., unipolar world, where so the threat of, people have swallowed this notion that it's only through investment that we'll get economic growth and then solve through a trickle-down version the unemployment problem. So it's a real threat to some of the people who accept that orthodoxy. So it's a brave move. It's a very brave move. There are very little benefits. And Tulas has pointed out the possibility of real action from the West, And what we are depending on and what we are relying on is the history of our own struggle. And that depended on people sometimes making sacrifices around the world in solidarity with our struggle. So the one element, Tula, is that, and we're racing against time, and we're facing a huge enemy, but we're hoping that the people of the world, including the people in the West, these massive demonstrations, the young Jewish people in the belly of the beast in the US occupying places, this is a genocide. And only if that action continues, regardless of the ICJ case, do we have a chance. So the irreparable damage that you correctly talked about can be limited. I mean, Biden is feeling some pressure. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist. He said as much. They are completely complicit, not even tacitly. They are supplying the bombs, and everything else, besides diplomatic cover and others. The Houthis are doing something concrete. And in a sense, they are abiding by international law. And their only demand is stop the genocide, ceasefire. So in a sense, they are bound, like every state is, by the Genocide Convention. So I'll stop there, but to say that the ANC government itself has taken this position because of consistent work by civil society, trade unions, movements over many years, hard slog, that has influenced this shift. We've been calling for this for a long, long time, and we've met receptive people, very skilled and talented people in government. That doesn't mean we will stop struggling against other things and criticizing them, criticizing the privatization, etc., which we will continue doing. And for many of us, it is not a contradiction. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim. And thank you all for joining and speaking today. Thank you to everyone tuning in online this evening. Unfortunately, we have run out of time on this occasion for more questions. I just want to send a massive thank you to our excellent speakers, to Tula Simpson, Heidi Greenborn, Salim Valley. So the Palestine Return Center has plenty of upcoming events to look out for. So please do keep watch on the Palestinian Return Center's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you very much.